when we sit back and reevaluate our decisions, did we make the right one, And that's something that those dispatchers and pilots have to live with the rest of their lives. We get one chance to make a decision, and like I said, luckily this wasn't an accident or a bigger deal than it was, but it happens, and sometimes the outcome isn't the best. So I mean, we just got to be able to make timely decisions in very short periods of time. So, and when you talk about the pilot thinking, well, what if we get to Twin Falls, and there's another airplane with collapsed landing gear or whatever, like what pilots need to remember is that it's a 1 in a million that we're going to have multiple failures. I mean, that's why we build redundancy into everything that we do. And if say they get to Twin Falls and there is somebody with a collapsed runway or collapsed gear on the runway, like, hang out. What else are you going to do? And if needs be, you just declare an emergency and go, we're coming in. Just take that tug and ram the hell out of that aircraft and push it off the runway enough. Or I'm landing on the damn taxiway. Whatever you got to do, you're going to get that airplane down on the ground safely. But, I would rather give myself the best option rather than, waiting for, I think that guy's call on stopping the Blue Angels and stuff was like a horrible decision. He has to have that 45 minutes reserved. That's required fuel. He had plenty of time to get to Grand Forks. He just didn't want to. And that's a big case. One of the human factors we talk about is like get there-itis. So sounds like he definitely had some of that going on. And he was just like, nope, I'm landing here. I'm not diverting. But he contacted the controller right off the bat. We're supposed to be landing right now. The Blue Angels are practicing. What do you want me to do? And the controller right away tells him, go to Grand Forks. I'm sorry, the Blue Angels, we published this TFR months ago. Like, the pilot should have at that point been like, my bad, I'm going to Grand Forks. But anyways,
I figure as soon as he departed, I assume that he came from Las Vegas, but from wherever they originated from on that flight, he and the first officer were immediately talking about that. And that was their conversation all the way up there. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And, well, I'm sure it doesn't look good for them, and I don't know what the results of it were, but it made the news.
Yeah. Yep. And that's just it, you'd be surprised how many pilots we have that do stupid stuff like that. Every day we're talking pilots down off the ledge as dispatchers. I swear there's more often than not. Like when I went to Aspen, Colorado, we got in the airplane, and I'm not even joking you. First words out of the pilot's mouth is, looks like we got some strong crosswinds at Aspen. We're going to give it one attempt, and on the go around, we'll just bug out and go back to Salt Lake. I'm not going to even attempt another one. It's like, knowing the nature of Aspen and how quickly everything changes in Aspen, I was just like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, you guys understand that each diversion, they've averaged out all the diversions over a year. Each diversion costs the company, as soon as they say we're diverting, that's an immediate charge to the company of $25,000. You know? And I get it, human life is worth a hell of a lot more than that. But when you've already decided that your game plan is to give it one shot and then get out of there, that's not good enough. The guy had like 6,500 pounds of fuel. He could have got back to Salt Lake twice with how much fuel he had on board when he was on approach at Aspen. You know, giving it one shot is not good enough. You know.
I'm sure you make a mental note of that pilot in case you're
Oh yeah.
dispatching him ever.
Oh yeah. When a pilot calls me up and says, "Hey, just throw this alternate," and it's like a real off the wall alternate that doesn't make any sense, I immediately go, this pilot, the very first opportunity he has, he's going to be diverting back to that destination that he's picking. Like, you just know when a pilot already has the mindset, I'm not, I don't want to be there, so first chance I get, I'm turning back and going home. You know. Well, and the funny thing was too is this pilot, he called up the dispatcher and said add an alternative Salt Lake. Dispatcher was like, okay, that's fine. The pilot, as soon as he hung up the phone with the dispatcher, he said he said, that whole, I'm going to give it one attempt and then we're coming back to Salt Lake. And then he goes, and then once we get back to Salt Lake, we're going to fill out fatigue forms, which basically, if a pilot says that he's fatigued, even just saying the words, I am fatigued, he immediately is disqualified from executing the flight. We have to pull him and put a new crew on the airplane. So that's total BS. In my book, it's just like, no way. How do you even justify that? You don't. So I don't know. There's a fine balance between the needs of the company and being safe, but sometimes pilots are so far on the like being safe or don't want to fly today that uh, they completely bypass any thought of company needs or taking care. And what people need to remember is that they, just as much as they have an obligation to their home life, they have an obligation to make sure that the company's successful, because as soon as the company fails, they don't have a paycheck. And so it's like it's a very fine balance, but some people just play it way too far on the other side of the fence, I feel.
So, Garrett, why would, in that case, why would he list Salt Lake as an alternate when he has Grand Junction and Colorado Springs right there?
So the reasoning was sound for his alternate of Salt Lake. That was the only flight for Aspen that day. And that's where the next leg was, regardless. Like, he was flying to Aspen to pick up passengers and then come back to Salt Lake. So, with passengers. So the game plan was Salt Lake, Aspen, Aspen, Salt Lake. And the passengers were already, a lot of times, the passengers that are flying between the two are already based in Salt Lake. Like, they already have means to go home or something, uh, somewhere to go in Salt Lake. So I agreed with his justification um, of choosing Salt Lake. Um, But and Grand Junction is a great alternate for Aspen in the wintertime. So in the wintertime, we have buses that if we can't make Aspen, will land in Grand Junction and they'll bus the passengers to Aspen. It's a lot more convenient. But in the summer, they don't run that. So it's like it's not worth landing in Grand Junction, fueling up, and going back into Aspen, especially when he has so much fuel on board, you know?
Thanks for the explanation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm fine with listing alternates as long as it makes sense. I'm fine with like complying with what the captain wants as long as it makes sense. But there's a point where it's just like, nope, that doesn't make sense. And if they continue to push it, rather than arguing with them, you just go, okay. And then you notate it on the release. Notified the pilot of this, this, and this. Pilot requested this against or regardless of my my input, and then you're not at fault, you know. You just kind of wash your hands from it and let the pilot take the heat. So yeah. Anyways, every scenario has 100 different options. It's just picking the one that suits the situation, you know, and your decision making at that time. It's 100% on just like at that moment. What is everything telling you? What's your gut telling you? What's the weather telling you? And you just kind of balance it out and make a decision. So, all right. So, to jump into the lesson today, just making sure Adam got all the way through the lighting system of the aircraft, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So we are on to navigation. How do you guys feel that you're understanding the CRJ? You guys feel good about everything so far?
I feel like I'm talking way too much. I'm going to let somebody else speak.
I feel like I'm getting there. I just need more time to go through things again.
Yeah. Well, if there's anything that we can do to answer questions or to help you guys with the material, please let us know. What I'd like to do is be able to go out and see a CRJ, even if it's a 200. A lot of it's the same. So let you guys actually get up close and personal with one. I know Adam's trying to set that up, but it'll probably be the last 2 weeks of the course. But it makes a lot more sense when you actually see it and touch it, feel it. Maybe talk to a pilot if a pilot's willing to hang out for a minute. But
yeah, that'd be really good. That'd be really cool too.
Yeah. So, navigation. So each navigation radio is capable of receiving both VOR DME and additional DME channels. We've got 2 RTUs, and then we have TCAS. So what happens with our TCAS is basically it sends up alert if we have a traffic threat within 25 seconds of impact of when impact would be. The TCAS will alert the pilot and give them a resolution. So what happens is it will tell one aircraft to turn to the right and descend, and the other aircraft to turn to the right and climb. That way you're both moving away from each other, both vertically and laterally. So creating that separation. So yeah, kind of a neat system. So the EGIPWIZ is what we call this. EGPWS is known as the EGIPWIZ. In the military, we called this something a lot different, but basically it gives a warning, an audible warning to the pilot whenever one of these things happen. The minimums, when it calls out minimums, are 100, 50, 40, 30, 10. That's all the EGIPWIZ. You'll also hear it call out, terrain, pull up. I'm sure people have heard that one. But these are the different things that it will warn the pilots about. So excessive descent rate, basically there's a good chance of overspeed, so it'll give them a audible tone and just say, you're descending too rapidly. If they are descending too rapidly and they're close to terrain, they'll get the terrain warning. Multiple different things. So, yeah, kind of a neat system. But O2 and emergency equipment. Oxygen is supplied to the flight crew, flight attendants, and passengers during an emergency. The flight deck is supplied with gaseous oxygen bottles. So the pilots actually have oxygen bottles. The flight attendant and passenger drop-down oxygen masks are supplied by a chemical oxygen generator. So what happens is, how they tell you to pull down on the oxygen mask when it drops. We call it a rubber jungle when the oxygen masks deploy, but because it looks like a bunch of vines hanging down, But they tell you to pull down on that cord first. What that does is that actually activates a chemical reaction to create the oxygen. There's like a couple bottles, and it just basically mixes the two to create the oxygen that flows to the passenger masks. The flight attendants also have an oxygen mask with an oxygen bottle that they can wheel up and down the aisle. And they wear this big old hood. Look like a spaceman. But you also carry therapeutic oxygen for people that freak out or have issues breathing. I'm sure flight attendants are trained on how to use therapeutic oxygen, but at the same time, I'm kind of nervous about a flight attendant administering oxygen. Jeff, were you saying that you're a flight attendant? You were a flight attendant?
Yeah, that's correct.
Were you trained on the oxygen masks?
We were. One thing to note about the oxygen cylinders that flight attendants have access to administer to a passenger is they are not medical grade. They're about half the strength of what you would get in a medical grade oxygen cylinder, say something a paramedic would have access to.
Yeah. That's good to know. I'm an EMT, and so I was kind of concerned about that because there's certain medical situations where giving people additional oxygen is the wrong thing to do. You know, people that have things like emphysema and things like that, it can actually suffocate them, giving them more oxygen. So good to know that it's just like bare minimum, just more. It's probably more of a placebo than it is actually doing them medical good.
I believe you're right. And oftentimes it may relieve a little bit of pressure. Let's say someone that's having a heart issue or something like that. It elevates their oxygen levels, and that's about it. Because they're in an environment where, at 8,000 feet in the cabin, they're at reduced levels from, most places on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So the crew masks, like it says here, they're full face, quick donning, and equipped with a microphone. So so that they can still communicate when they have their oxygen masks on. The chemical generators provide oxygen for 13 minutes. So basically that's enough for the pilot to descend from like cruise altitude to 12,000 feet safely. That's about all. I like to show my students this video of what happens when you don't receive enough oxygen at altitude. In the military, we use a altitude chamber to go through rapid decompression and stuff like that. Training. Let's see. But basically what they do in these chambers is they will give the pilots a simple task, and they'll allow them to do the simple task with oxygen, and then they tell them to remove their masks. And it's pretty incredible how quickly things change. So everybody, why don't you give that a quick look at, and we'll jump back on in 2 minutes. That video didn't show anything. I wanted to show you. My bad. This is this is what I've used before, so everybody give that one a quick look-see. Sorry about that. Pretty incredible what hypoxia can do to you, huh? So, um, something kind of interesting is the F-22, F-35, F-16 have all been identified as having faulty oxygen scrubbers, and pilots are still getting hypoxia even with their regulators on. It's kind of interesting to see what they're doing right now. But yeah, you could see how someone's home but the lights aren't on. Yeah, it's pretty incredible to watch that. Yeah. So the passenger masks will automatically deploy at a cabin altitude. So in the pressure in the cabin reaches 14,000 feet, but they can also be deployed manually from the cockpit. Another funny story about that is we had a pilot a couple months back who claimed he was swatting a fly and hit the passenger mask release and deployed all the passenger masks. And yeah, luckily he was able to catch it in time and tell the passengers not to put the masks on, that everything was okay. But you can imagine the surprise and the shock that everybody on board felt. So PBE, or protective breathing equipment, units are installed in the flight deck and passenger cabin to provide oxygen and smoke protection for crew members. No passengers. Emergency equipment includes, and these all have to be on board before the pilot can leave. He has to have these. The fire axe, fire extinguishers, overhead hatch escape rope, life vest, flashlights, overwing emergency exit escape ropes, and a megaphone. So, all required equipment. All right, pneumatics. What are pneumatics again?
Is it the air hydraulics, or am I wrong?
So, like hydraulics, but not hydraulics. It's air driven. So, hydraulics are liquid driven. But pneumatic means that it's air driven. Some of the key points. So during the most phases of flight, the engines supply the bleed air for the system operations and pneumatic system, and it's managed automatically. Managed automatically. Did I say that, or did I say managed pneumatically? Brain fart. Pneumatically operated systems include engine starting, cowl and wing anti-ice, air conditioning. In the CRJ 700, and this is a little bit different than the 200, but in the 700s and 900s, the pneumatic system receives pressurized air from either the 6th or the 10th stage of the left or right engine compressors, the APU, or from the APU, or from an external ground source. So the ground source would be like an air start cart. The key to remember here is that the 6th stage provides the bleed air, the 10th is a backup. So when the 6th stage is overloaded, then it will start pulling the bleed air off of the 10th stage. So
can you explain that a little more? What are these stages?
So just the stage of the engine. So when we look at a turbine engine,
Are these the different parts of the fan system that, as the compressor is going through, what's the 6th and the 10th?
kind of, there's Let's see if this shows it. So it depends on the type of engine, but basically you can see like this aircraft. If we zoom in here, the 7th stage is near the front of the engine, and the 10th or 12th stage is basically where the explosion part is, right? But yeah, there's basically a hose that is tapped into those different stages that will pull that bleed air off of the engine. So it'll actually like vent into these air systems, pneumatic systems, and supply the pressurized air. So, and of course, it's going to go through different assemblies to cool it down or to regulate the pressure, things like that. But yeah, the six stages, it's going to be up near the front, and the 10th stage is basically where the what is it called, the burn stage is. So just different parts of the engine is where it's pulling it from. Really the only thing that we need to know is just which stages. So yeah, we're never going to be asked to identify them on a map or anything like that, but the common bleed air manifold distributes the bleed air, so it all goes to this common air bleed manifold, or common bleed air manifold, and then from there it will be distributed to the other systems that require it. All the bleed air management is fully automated, with manual control available for non-normal ops. To minimize the damage from a bleed air leak, the pneumatic ducts are continuously monitored by the bleed air leak detection system. So let's say a line breaks, it's going to shut off the supply to that line. And you're probably going to want to land quick. Because remember, this air is typically extremely hot, and it's coming out at high pressures, so it could quickly lead to other problems on the aircraft. Yeah, this just talks about what I said. The 6th stage is the primary. It supplies all the air to operate pneumatically powered systems. But when the demand exceeds capacity of the 6th stage, a high pressure valve automatically opens to supply higher pressure 10th stage bleed air to the manifold. So, yeah, so just remember 6th and 10th. 6th is the primary, 10th is the secondary. But yeah.
So what I understand from that, Garrett, is that each one of these different fans is producing a higher and higher pressure the higher it gets.
Yeah, so
as the air gets back to the 10th or 12th stage, it's already been compressed by previous stages.
exactly. So as I showed you guys in the in some of these in a previous class, we talked kind of about the jet engine and how it works. But basically what happens is, as you can see here, the N1, this part of the engine, these fan blades at the front of the engine, they're going to be a lot thicker, a lot wider, like fan blade. But as we go back on this N1, it gets smaller and smaller and tighter the spaces do. So it's just taking that air and it's just compressing it extremely tight, and then it's forcing it into the combustion chamber, and that's where it mixes with the fuel and it sparks, creating the thrust or the exhaust phase. And this is where all the thrust is coming from, basically. So yeah, it squeezes the air tighter and tighter and compresses it. But yeah, the 6th stage would be somewhere around here, and the 10th stage would be closer to the back here. But we have what we call like I want to say it's a high bypass turbine now, where there's actually fan blades outside of this that will actually turn as well. So you've got this jet turbine encased in a another bigger cowl, and it's got a gigantic fan on the front of it as well. So it's got air that's flowing over the engine, but then it's also helping start the compression for this part of the engine. And the air bypassing the engine actually produces more thrust than the air inside the engine. So you'll see those on like the 737s and bigger, but a lot more efficient jet engines. In fact, this is what it looks like. You have these extra fans that are on the outside of the original turbine there. That's what one looks like, completely exposed, not in its cowl. And see, this is what's amazing to me is so this is similar to the engine on the 737. But this black stuff here, all the way back, the engine cowl that this slides into is all wrapped in Kevlar. And they will, like, when they're testing these jet engines, they'll throw like frozen turkeys and crap into them to try to get them to malfunction, try to get them to blow up. And on that Southwest flight, even though there was an explosion in the engine, like an uncontrolled explosion, it still ripped through like all of that Kevlar coating. Like, it was a complete perfect storm at that Southwest flight. Because like the part that busted through the cabin, you know, that should have never happened. It's crazy the perfect, you know, how big of a perfect storm it actually was to generate the result we saw. So the 700 is equipped with 2 GE CF34 8C1s or the 8C5B1s. High bypass turbofans. The normal takeoff thrust rating is rated at 12,670 pounds of thrust. One engine operation thrust with the APR is 13,790. So our normal thrust that we're going to be throwing out the back as we're cruising down the runway at full throttle is going to be that 12,670 pounds. On board the aircraft, we have what is called an APR, or Automatic Performance Reserve. It's built into the FADEC, and what it does is if there was an engine failure, the APR will basically overboost the engine that's still operating to help generate enough thrust to get the aircraft off the runway. So that's why we'll see a significant increase in the thrust if there was one engine loss. Engines are flat rated to ISA plus 15 degrees at sea level. So our standard temperature at sea level is 15 degrees. And that's what we would call ISA. So when it says ISA plus 15 degrees, it means that it's 15 degrees, it's rated, so that 12,670 pounds of thrust that it's generating is rated at sea level plus 15 degrees Celsius. And we'll talk about why that's significant later. But when we go through meteorology. But basically, this thing's made to function at much warmer temperatures than standard. And we kind of touched on it when we were talking about like Flagstaff and bumping passengers when we only, when it was like, 120 degrees or 85 degrees. I can't remember what you said, but the airport's at 7,500 feet elevation. It's pretty significant what altitude does to our engine thrust. So we'll kind of connect the dots there when we talk about meteorology. But each power plant is controlled by a full authority digital engine control system, or also known as a FADEC. So the FADEC is, like I said a couple days ago, the FADEC is basically the brains of the engine, of the whole power plant system. So it's monitoring the engines, the different fan speeds and things like that. Engine has two independent major assemblies, the N1 and the N2. I think we've beat that dead horse. The N1 section consists of a fan rotor that is driven through a shaft by a 4-stage low-pressure turbine. And we've shown you that. The N2 section is comprised of a 10-stage axial flow combustor accessory gearbox and 2-stage high-pressure turbine. So basically, if it's not the N1, it's the N2. Engine airflow passes through the single-stage fan and is divided into two airflow paths, the bypass and the core air. So the CRJ does have the high bypass engine, as I showed you guys. So the bypass air is accelerated by the N1 fan and is ducted around the engine nacelle to produce the most of the thrust generated at takeoff. So the N1 is what's producing most of the thrust at takeoff. The core air is accelerated by the N1 fan, then enters the N2 core where it is compressed, mixed with fuel, and ignited. The N1 fan is single stage fan that consists of 28 titanium alloy blades. A Kevlar blanket is wrapped around the fan housing to contain possible damage from a failed N1 fan. Again, something we already kind of talked about. A fuel and oil heat exchanger is used to warm the engine fuel and cool engine oil. So it's kind of like a symbiotic relationship. Engine oil gets really hot as it's running through the engine. And then when they pass it by the fuel to warm up the fuel, it's cooling that engine oil and then returned to the engine. If anybody's worked with cars, airplanes, or anything, you know that heat is bad for them. So the hotter it gets, the worse it performs. So the FADEC, each power plant has its own dual channel FADEC computer. One channel is in control, processing information to provide engine control outputs. The other channel operates in standby. So redundancy, right? So basically, this is talking about how it works. So the in control and standby channels continuously share command and status data through a crosstalk data bus. Should the designated in control channel become unserviceable, the standby channel assumes the in control role. And the FADEC has its own power system. So kind of important comparing the FADEC to a brain. If that brain shuts down, so does that engine. We lose that engine, it's out. So kind of important. So the FADEC malfunctions are presented as either caution or status messages. Each message has a different impact on the dispatchability of the aircraft. If we get a fault 1, it's a 10-day deferral. Fault 2 is a 30-day deferral. And then FADEC caution messages, there's no deferral associated with them. So when we talk about deferral, what happens is we can still operate the flight, but it's required that we monitor that system for those 10 days. If there's an additional failure, basically we have to fix it before we can continue operating. Engine idle. So when the thrust lever is placed in idle, the minimum N2 idle RPM is programmed by the FADEC. The idle RPM is dependent on atmospheric information, bleed air loading, and phase of flight. So when we're landing or in our descent, that idle is going to be different than when we're just sitting on the ground trying to taxi, but we're stuck behind multiple other jets trying to do the same thing. It's basically saying that the idle RPM is dependent on these other additional factors. The FADEC will always program the best idle speed for any phase of flight. Engine out operations. The FADEC computers automatically crosstalk to share data on the health of each engine. The FADEC will automatically increase the thrust on the operating engine when the other engine fails. Or if the difference in N1 speeds exceeds 15%, the FADEC will automatically increase the N1 speed of the operable engine. So if one engine falls 15% lower in performance than the other engine, basically it will start boosting the other engine to compensate. The APR, already talked about this, automatic performance reserve, available during normal takeoff or reduced flex takeoff and landing, and the go around phases. So what it's talking about when it says a reduced flex takeoff. Basically, what happens is we trick the engine into believing that it's at a higher altitude than it actually is. You know, talked about how higher altitudes affect engines greater due to the amount of air that's actually at that altitude. So what happens is as we increase the altitude or trick the engine into believing it's at a higher altitude, it will apply the thrust slower and not as much thrust. And what that does is it will increase the fuel economy of the engine and reduce the amount of maintenance that engine requires during its lifetime. So there's two huge benefits from doing reduced thrust or flex takeoffs. But not every takeoff will allow us to do a reduced or flex takeoff. One of the biggest factors of that is going to be our runway length. So depending on runway length, we may not even be able, runway length and temperature outside, we may not be able to do a reduced thrust or flex takeoff. The FADEC automatically computes a target thrust setting for the selected thrust lever's position. So, like I said before, the FADEC, it doesn't matter if the pilot jams it all the way to the stops, the FADEC's going to decide how much thrust the engine actually needs to accomplish the task that it's being asked to perform. So, regardless of where the thrust levers are. And we already talked about that. I keep jumping ahead of myself. Talked about the 6th and 10th stage of the engine compressor, normally provided on the 6th stage. And we already talked about all of that. Thrust lever settings. There's basically these marks on the thrust levers. There's one for shut off, idle, climb, toga, max power, cruise setting is going to range between idle and climb. So toga is like go around. So if there's like somebody occupying the runway when they're coming into land and they have to go full thrust, they go to toga. So let's see, where are we at? So the thrust reverser system, show you what a thrust reverser looks like. So basically what happens is when we touch down, it's going to deploy, and what it's doing is it's reversing, or, you know, just as the name says or implies, it's taking the thrust that's being output by the engine and pushing it forward rather than out the back. So it's just changing the angle of the airflow to help slow down the aircraft. You can see there, pivoting door, normal thrust, and then you have the when the thrust reverser is deployed, it just deflects it forward. So this is accomplished by blocking and redirecting the forward, the fan bypass air. The reversers are hydraulically actuated. Left engine reverser is powered by hydraulic system 1, and the right is powered by system 2. Water and waste. That's got to be a crappy job. Water systems store and supply potable water. Oh, sorry. let me say that correctly, potable water and lavatory wash water. The forward system is for the galley and the aft is for the lav. And there's a single point control panel located in the galley. So the flight attendants, if they want to mess with people, they can shut off the water to the back and then they can't wash their hands. Kind of gross. Galley water tank supplies water to the sink and coffee maker. So kind of funny story here. Like a month ago, we were talking to maintenance and flight attendant goes in to make coffee before the flight starts and hits the button to start filling the coffee pots. Blue water starts filling the coffee pots. Some jacknut on the ramp had hooked up blue water to the potable water and filled the aircraft with blue water rather than potable water. Absolutely disgusting. There's a saying when you work in the airlines, don't drink the coffee on an airplane. I highly, highly, highly advise you to take heed to that. Do not drink the coffee on an airplane. Not only does it suck anyways, but it's like that potable water system. Gross. And think about it, these tanks that they transport and hook up to the jets with, like, just, it's a bad idea. It's gross. Don't drink the coffee, please, for the love of everything holy. Electric pumps move the water from the tanks, tank hoses, the hose assemblies, galley drain lines, and overboard drain masts. It's all heated because it gets really cold at 30,000 feet. We're talking like negative 54 degrees. Water tanks are refilled and drained from two service panels on the right side of the fuselage. The waste disposal system holds lavatory waste and provides a means of discarding waste materials. Draining, cleansing, rinsing, pre-charging of the toilet holding tank is done from a service panel located in the right rear fuselage. So just like your RV, right? It's almost identical system. They come up, they hook up their hose to it, drain everything. They have water hoses that they can run up to the aircraft and fill her up with potable water. But yeah, very similar to the system on your RV. So, I don't know why we need to go over differences because you guys don't know any better between the 200 and the 700. But while we're at it, there's the different types. You can see this is a 2B19 for the 200. The 2C10 is our 700. The 200 has crappier engines that don't perform nearly as well. The CRJ 700 has a fuselage of 18.5 feet longer. That is 18.5 feet longer, and a wingspan that is 6.5 feet wider and sits 3.5 feet taller. So it's bigger in every way. You get into a CRJ 700 after you've been in a 200, and you feel like the plane goes on forever. The 700 has both a forward and aft cargo bay. The two flight attendant positions are required because it has 70 seats. You guys remember when we were talking about the FARs? 50 50 seats and less, 1 flight attendant. 50 to 100 requires 2 flight attendants. Basically, for every 50 passengers, you have to add a flight attendant to the aircraft. No differences in the FCS systems. Flight director takeoff pitch information is enhanced and optimized. The APU differences, the exhaust is located in the tail cone and discharged through the tail cone. That's where the APU is too. So no APU exhaust temperature hazard because it's like 10 feet off the ground. Operating envelope, numbers we don't really want to pay attention to because that's not what we do at SkyWest. We operate at different altitudes. Fuel feed. APU pump draws fuel from left collector tank via dedicated APU pump. Cool. No flight deck system or operational difference. You sit in the cockpit 100% identical. Only difference is there's more 700s that we have operating for us that have 2 FMS systems. A lot of the 200s only have 1 FMS system, and it's on the pilot side. So the captain's side, sorry. So that's the big difference that you'll see between the 2 cockpits. CRJ 700 is equipped with forward cargo bay door located below the cabin and just forward of the wing. Already talked about that. System differences. Basically, there's fewer components, higher related generators and TRUs, and then level of automation and operating limits. So the CRJ 700 is better than the 200, basically, is what that says. The ACPC controls power distribution, no AC utility buses. DC power comes from 4 TRUs and 2 batteries, whereas on the 200 it comes from 5 TRUs and 2 batteries. No provision for DC electrical power. 2 air conditioning systems monitored by the ECS, whereas the 200 it's handled by each pack. Recirculation fan utilized to increase airflow within the cabin. We have a single triple channel outflow safety valve, whereas the CRJ only has 2. The maximum altitude for a single pack operation is 31,000 feet, whereas the CRJ 200 is 25,000 feet. And we talked about the reason why 31,000 feet for the 700 because of fuel flow concerns. They want to make sure that the fuel flow is not prohibited by altitude to the APU, or I'm sorry, to the single pack. And then for the 200, the reason why it's limited to 25,000 feet is due to. Nope, my bad. Totally thinking of the wrong thing. That's APU differences. Fire and overheat differences. No jet pipe overheat warnings. Engine pylon areas are monitored by anti-leak. Detection controllers. The APU does not have fire warning horn. Common halon extinguishing systems consisting of 2 bottles is shared between both cargo bays. Both bottles discharged into affected bay. And this is just a whole bunch of stuff that we don't really care about because you guys don't know the differences anyway. So let's focus on the 700. And that'll do it for that presentation. Any questions? You guys feel exhausted from going through 130 slides?
Yes.
More than you ever
Very
thought
yes.
you'd know about a single airplane, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a dinner break. Does that sound good to everybody? And we'll jump back on at 7:20.
What are you serving for dinner?
Filet mignon and scallops.
I'll be right there.
Good stuff, huh?
And you're coming back on when? 7? Or
7:20.
Thanks.
Yep. All right, is everybody back? Hope I'm not the only one.
I'm back.
So, what we're going to talk about next is MELs and CDLs. So, who knows what an MEL is? Basically, an MEL stands for Minimum Equipment List. So, what that means is we are allowed to continue operating flights even though there's parts broken on the airplane. So we can have, and we've talked about like different deferrals, quote unquote. The MEL is basically a deferred item. So we can defer items or we can put off doing the maintenance on items and continue operating flights as long as we meet certain criteria. And basically what happens is the maker of the aircraft and then our maintenance people and the FAA build an essential equipment list, and we have to get it all approved through the FAA. But basically, the FAA says you guys can continue to operate as long as you meet A, B, and C. So this is the list that they come out with, the MELs. So depending on what is deferred, we have different requirements that we have to follow. So we'll go through some of those. But then a CDL is what we call a configuration deviation list. And what a configuration deviation is talking about mostly something structural. Something has changed structurally that we need to take into consideration. Depending on what it is, we may have to add weight to the aircraft. We may take what we call a weight penalty for certain things. We may have to take a performance penalty for certain things. But basically, the CDL is just telling us what we need to take into account when we have something go wrong structurally. Then we also have things called NEFs. Basically, it's non-essential equipment. So things like the coffee maker, passenger tray tables, things like that don't require an MEL, like don't even require us to go out of service at all. it sucks for the passenger that has to deal with that sometimes, but it's not really essential for the flight. People can go without coffee, believe it or not, for 2 hours, especially when it's blue water coffee, which, ew, right? So yeah, this is just telling us how to operate when we have problems with the aircraft. So we're just gonna kind of cruise through some of these different things and how to use this manual. So one of the most effective things, and one of the things that you need to learn for when you go into an airline, once you're working for an airline, is if you're looking for something, always start with the index here. This tells you where everything's located. So looking at our CRJ 700, Chapter 21 is about AC packs, 22's auto flight, communications, electrical power, and so on. And this tells us where to find the pages that affect those different items. Probably the single most important thing that you'll learn when it comes to learning manuals is what does the manual deal with and where's the index. That's pretty much all you need to know, and then you can find anything you need to find. So the way the MELs are written out is it's going to have basically the chapter. So air conditioning, anything to do with the air conditioning system, the first number and the 3-digit or the 3-number code is going to be, the first 2 numbers will be 21, and then it'll have another set of numerical numbers and then an additional set, and we'll look at those. Same thing with the CDLs. CDLs follow the exact same procedures. Some of the things, if you don't know how to read an MEL or how to understand how to apply an MEL, you can always look at this explanation of format, and it'll tell you what the different boxes mean, how to apply it. So this is what an MEL looks like, and let's zoom in nice and tight here. Okay. What this is saying is, once again, this is something to do with the air conditioning system. The forward galley exhaust fan is deferred. This is a category C, so you can come up here to the explanation and look for the category C. But basically what the category is, I'm trying to find it on here. Basically what that category means is when is the maintenance required. So how long, this identifies how long they have until they have to fix the item from when it's first written up. This tells us how many are installed on the aircraft and how many are required to be working. So once again, installed, required. So we have one installed. We don't need any of them to be working for us to operate our flight. Okay, this remarks section tells us what we have to do. Okay, May be inoperative provided the fan is deactivated. So basically turn it off. Don't use it. Pretty simple, right? The maintenance procedure tells maintenance what they have to do. Maintenance has to go in and they've got to pull the circuit breaker for the galley exhaust fan. So it tells them what panel the circuit breaker is, what circuit breaker number, and the name of the circuit breaker that they're pulling. Okay. Super, super easy. We don't care about this box. Okay. Placarding. Sometimes it requires that we put a placard or a label on the affected equipment. Okay. This is something that maintenance, once again, will do. When they come in and they pull the circuit breaker here, they will place the placard on there. So we don't really care about these two sections at all. The only two sections that will say anything that we have to do dispatch-wise is going to be in the remarks or exceptions, and then the operation procedure. Okay. So operations, there's no operational restriction applied to this MEL. That's it. Sometimes what we'll see over here in this box, like right in that location, sometimes we'll see something that says no RVSM or no Cat2. What that's saying is when we have this MEL, we cannot operate in RVSM airspace, or if it says no Cat2, we cannot do a Cat2 approach. So need to pay attention to that. But MELs are pretty simple to read. Everything is laid out in the same exact format. So let's go through and just kind of identify some of the bigger, more important ones. Let's see. Display cooling fans. Okay, this one can be a big deal. What these do is they just keep the primary flight display and the multifunction display cool, because those displays generate an extreme amount of heat. So if we have a fan go out, sometimes the display will fail. And if a display fails, and say it's the primary flight display, captain's not going to know how high he is, how fast he's going, his rate of descent, things like that. As you can imagine, things can get dicey quick. So this will tell us display cooling fans. There's 2 installed, 1's required. Okay. We can have one inoperative, but we need to make sure that the check valve is operative. Maintenance procedure, once again, we don't care about. Operations procedure. We don't have anything in here that's necessarily telling us anything dispatch-wise, but something to remember is that the display fans, if we have a display fan, say there's no restrictions currently happening, and we take off. If a display cooling fan fails in flight, the pilot has to land the aircraft at the nearest suitable airport, because of the possibility that his display will go out. They want him to get down and get it checked out as quickly as possible. So, kind of a big deal. But nothing planning-wise, there's nothing that affects dispatch. see if I can find one. So here's one. So the emergency depress switch guard. So what happens with this one is right here. This is something that directly affects dispatch, right? Operations are conducted unpressurized at or below 10,000 feet MSL. So in this case, can we go long haul? Probably not. Do we really want to carry passengers and stay at 10,000 feet or below? Depends on how far the flight is, but kind of a big deal. Flight level restrictions, the big thing for us to watch out for is that we don't plan the aircraft higher. We need to make sure that the computer plans us at 10,000 feet. So, kind of an interesting restriction.
So am I missing something here? On that one right there, it says 0 are required to operate the flight.
Exactly. So they can continue to operate the flight if we don't have any working. So this is just a switch guard, right? So the only restriction is if we are going to continue to operate with none of these working, we have to conduct all operations under 10,000 feet or 10,000 feet or below. So,
Okay.
so we can continue to operate, but we just have that restriction that we've got to comply with.
That was where I was missing the link.
Yep. Let's see if we've got some more here. So here's another one. This is the AC pack, right? We have 2 on board. We're required to always have 1. Do you guys remember in the PowerPoint when it said that when we have 1 AC pack operative, flight operations have to be conducted at flight level 310 and below? There it is right there, okay? There's our restriction. So, excuse me. That's just showing you guys why it said that on the PowerPoint. Here's another one. Depending, once again, this is applicable to the CRJ 900. So this one, there's 2 different aircraft. Remember, this one's applicable to the 700. This one's applicable to the 900. Okay. So with the 700, like we said before, it has to be at or below 31,000 feet. The 900 is for kicks and giggles, flight level 250. So let's see here. Let's go back up to the top. Dang it. All right. So here's one that's interesting. This is an IDG. Remember what the IDGs do? What do the IDGs do? Why do we have IDGs? I'm going to let it get real awkward until I get an answer.
Turns the generators inside the turbine engine.
Not quite. So the IDGs, they are the primary source of AC electrical power.
Okay, guys, I just sacrificed myself for you.
So, super important. Systems are a part of the practical exam, and IDGs guarantee you what's going to, one of the things that's going to be asked is, what is the primary source of AC electrical power? 2 IDGs, or integrated drive generators. Then they're going to ask, what is the auxiliary source of AC electrical power? What is that?
The APU.
APU, okay. And then what is the emergency source of AC electrical power?
That spinning wheel of death?
Uh-huh. What is it called?
Is that the ADG?
Uh-huh. So air-driven generator. So super important on the electrical systems. I know those ones are asked. So here is why it's so important that we know. So like I said before, we have 2 on board. We can have 1 inoperative, right? Here's the kicker. The APU is operated continuously throughout flight. Okay, we always have to have 2 sources of AC electrical power. Okay, that also means that we can only conduct our operations at or below 32,000 feet. Okay. So there's a flight level restriction, and the APU has to be ran continuously. That means that we have to add fuel to the aircraft. Do you guys remember how much fuel the APU burns an hour?
200 pounds.
Close.
260.
Yep, 260. Okay. So super important that we know that one. And in just a minute, I'll tell you why we're so concerned about MELs. Okay. So one other thing to remember is that aircraft systems if you get hired by SkyWest, I'm just saying, know from personal experience with SkyWest, that is one of the big things that they drill you on your comp check is systems. So we need to get all comfy cozy with our systems. And it's part of the curriculum, required curriculum for this class is you have to know and understand the operating procedures of an aircraft. So, we kind of touched on some of the highlights. We did touch on the highlights, and we're going to, in the test, we'll have it that we take next week, probably on Tuesday. Monday we'll do a review. Tuesday we'll take the test. And it's a short test, but we will ask certain things. Please make sure that you understand them and that we knock all questions out on Monday. We squash any questions about how things work. Pretty important. Anyways, so that's what we need to remember with an IDG failure. Remember that aviation, the FAA really, really, really loves redundancy, so that's why we always have to have two sources of AC electrical power running. And always remember, and it will never change regardless of what aircraft you're on, if we have a failure on an electrical system, typically that's going to require us to engage the APU. Running the APU throughout flight, during the entire flight, is extremely rare. The only time that we ever do that is when we have an IDG failure. Every once in a while they'll kick on the APU, typically, but it's few and far between. Pretty rare. Anyways, just remember that it has a flight level restriction and then a fuel restriction, and that's really what's important to know on the IDG. So what if the APU isn't working? Well, we've got two IDGs, right? We've only got one APU, and remember it's auxiliary to the IDGs. Okay. One installed, zero required. So we just have to make sure that both the IDGs are operative. When we have an APU out, though, we want to make sure that the downline stations, and I know I've mentioned this before, but just in review, we want to make sure that the downline stations have a ground power unit and an air start, because if we get to that station and the pilot shut off the jet, the APU's primary role in engine start is that it provides the bleed air to start the engines. So the APU being in op is kind of an important thing. So not a whole lot for us to do, but still something for us to do on those. Now, when we're actually flight planning, and this is kind of what I wanted to get to, was when we're actually doing our flight plans, you guys will receive a packet. I'm going to pull up what those packets look like. Let me see if I've got one. Okay. So when we start doing our flight plan, we do what's called a route briefing guide. Okay. So what happens is we are going to give you guys this packet. It tells us the aircraft that we're going to be operating, how many people we have on board, and how many bags. Okay. Then this right here is an MEL. Okay. So what's going to happen is when you see an MEL on a flight plan on one of our route briefings, what we need to do is we need to go and check that MEL and check what restrictions are associated with that MEL. Okay. So just to help you guys understand how we apply this, let's say that one of our MELs is a 24-22-1. Okay. That means it's an APU generator system. Our requirement is that we have both IDGs operative, correct? Let's say there's an additional MEL that says that we have a 24-11-1A, and we know that that's an IDG failure, okay? So we saw that the APU failure stated that both IDGs have to be working, okay? We come up here and we see this MEL, and it says that the APU has to be continuously operated throughout the flight. Well, our APU isn't operative. Our APU isn't working. And our IDG, one of our IDGs isn't working. So can we operate a flight with one IDG?
No.
No. I mean, if the APU wasn't failed, like if the APU wasn't deferred, then we could continue operation. But with an IDG and an APU failing or not working, deferred, we can't operate the flight. So what we would do at that point is, as the student, we'd approach the instructor or the DAID, the person that's administering the practical test, and say, due to MEL 2411-1A and 2411, what was it? 2411 or 2422-1, I cannot operate the flight. The APU is in op and one IDG is in op. Then we would tell you, hey, maintenance came and fixed the IDG, or maintenance came and fixed the APU. And then we'd have to go back and look at the MEL and make sure that everything jives and that we're applying the restrictions associated with the MEL. Okay. Does that make sense at all?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
So MELs are super important to our flight planning. We need to make sure that we can still operate with these failures. We need to compare the MELs to one another and make sure that one doesn't cancel the other one out, or make us illegal to operate. So yeah, make sure that when you are looking at MELs, you're looking at these remarks, looking at the restrictions. You may see something down here as well. You know, like this one says aircraft operations at 32,000 feet APU continuously for performance correction. Make sure you're checking those two boxes, right? And make sure that you're complying with those restrictions. There's another couple that I wanted to take a look at. And I wish this was like the one that I have at work, because I can just like click between pages, go back to the index page in one click of a button. Okay, here's one that I wanted to look at. This wing crossbleed valve. So once again, we've got one installed, one required on the aircraft. When reading through our restrictions here, don't necessarily care about pilot's going to do that. We want to make sure that we have both SLVs, but other than that, we don't really care about. If this is the only MEL that we're seeing, don't really care to go and check that. Don't really care to check that. Okay, right here. Operations are not conducted in known or forecast icing conditions. Okay, so what does that mean? When we get to meteorology, we'll talk about what constitutes an icing condition. And I'll tell you right now what that is. Icing can occur at 10 degrees Celsius or below and visible moisture being present. So what is visible moisture? A cloud, rain, mist, fog. That's all visible moisture. So if it is 10 degrees Celsius or below, and there's visible moisture somewhere along our route, we can't fly into it. So, looking at like clouds, we know that's a visible moisture. Clouds made up of moisture in the air. If it's overcast at our departure airport or our destination airport, if it's overcast, is there a way for us? An overcast cloud later means that 100% of the sky is full of clouds. Looking straight up and looking 360 degrees, all you can see are clouds in the sky. And it's 5 degrees Celsius outside, can't operate the flight. We would never be able to get into that destination or take off without going into an icing condition. So that being said, we couldn't use this aircraft at all. It would be illegal to operate. So really important that we read through and find these little nuggets right here, and make sure that we're applying them. Because if we don't, and we send this plane, ice building on an aircraft is a really bad thing, as we've already said numerous times. You get too much ice on there, plane doesn't fly anymore. So we need to be careful when we're looking at our MELs and making sure that we're applying them correctly. Any questions about this so far? Statements? Comments? Jokes?
Well, since you asked, this, never mind, I better not say anything. You're trying to scare us. You're doing a great job.
So the reason why I say these things and making sure that we're applying the MELs is typically on a flight plan, we're not going to see more than maybe 1 or 2 MELs. Okay. I've seen as many as 7 on a flight, but really when I looked at it, it was like passenger seat recline, and it just listed the seats, and each seat required its own MEL. So that's why there were 7 different ones, is because 7 passenger seats didn't recline. Really, the big hitters when we're talking about MELs, you're going to know. With the training that we provide and the training that the airline that you work for provides, you'll understand the aircraft system. And the reason why we lump the MELs and the system together is to give you an understanding of why we need to know systems and why we need to understand how to apply an MEL. It's rare that maintenance will let a plane. Okay, first of all, it's rare that you will see multiple MELs that would cause a flight to be illegal. Typically, that's caught long before it ever hits your desk when you're working for an airline. I don't think I've ever seen it happen before where somebody had 2 MELs that were illegal actually hit their dispatch desk, that made the flight illegal. It just doesn't happen. The maintenance coordinators, the controllers, they are looking at these things before it ever hits your desk, and the captain of the aircraft. They're looking at these things long before it ever hits your desk and making a decision on, is this legal to dispatch? That being said, out of good practice, we always verify, right? because we don't want to put our name on something. And, it's, again, the safety of the flight is all dependent on us and the PIC, right? We're the only two people listed on the FAR as being responsible for the flight. So I don't want to put my name on something that I haven't actually checked myself and made sure. But typically, just saying, you won't ever see that be an issue. What you will see be an issue is, did I apply that MEL? There are times when you're going along and maybe you missed that it had to be scheduled at 32,000 feet, like we couldn't plan any higher than 32,000 feet. And you forgot to put that into the flight plan, and all of a sudden it plans it at 33,000 feet. Simple, small error that you missed, right? But, it happens. And we just need to do our due diligence as dispatchers to make sure that we're doing it correctly. Some of the other things that we see is an FMS deferral or a GPS deferral. We have to plan that flight using what we call green needles. So basically they have to fly according to the VORs, the ground-based navigational aids. They can't use any satellite navigation. So they have to use the old school VOR instrumentation and stuff like that. So some of the mistakes that happen with that is that somebody accidentally plans a SID or a star that has GPS required on it, things like that. There's always going to be mistakes, but the big thing that you need to remember as a dispatcher is that there's only a couple things that are like you violated an FAR that you're going to run into. Typically, those are things like, I didn't plan an alternate when I should have planned an alternate. I didn't apply, things like that. They're like really huge and obvious. The other things a lot of times are going to be company policies that we didn't put into play. And it's a simple mistake. You go, oops, I learned my lesson. I'll check for that from here on out, and you move on. I know Adam, I think me and Adam both hit this point when on the first day when we were talking about, the FAA. The FAA's really gotten to a point where they're not going to come and take your license away because you didn't plan an alternate. Back in the day, you had some real jerks that worked for the FAA, and that's why they have a reputation for the reputation they do have, is because sometimes you had FAA guys that were just total power hungry freaks that, you made a mistake, they'd pull your license. The FAA doesn't work like that anymore. The FAA is very, very good at working with you and making sure that we learn from our mistakes, right? The FAA will submit what we call an ASAP to the FAA. And basically we turn ourselves in. We say, you know what? I screwed up. I should have planned an alternate for this flight, and I didn't. This is what I learned from it. This is what I've done to correct the problem. And we move on. Nobody cares at that point. It's as if it didn't happen. As far as like the book goes, What we need to make sure that we're doing is learning from mistakes. Everybody's going to make those mistakes. When I was in training, there were a couple days where I missed an alternate, but my trainer caught that I had missed an alternate. It happens. don't be afraid to make mistakes, because if you do, you're going to make more mistakes. It's kind of crazy how it works. You've just got to be confident and plan the way you know how to. So as far as that goes, and scaring you guys like that, that's not the intention there. But we're going to give you, the tools and resources to help you identify where the issues are, where the problems are. And we're going to help you guys mitigate those issues of failing to comply with FARs and stuff like that. So everybody that has taken this class, including myself, up to and including flight planning, has felt like they didn't know enough and felt completely inadequate for what they were doing. But then they get into the practical test and they realize that they actually do know what the hell they're doing. And everything just kind of clicks at the end. A lot of it, you just got to trust yourself, And the thing that Adam and I have figured out with this course is that because of the schedule we have you guys on of 5 days of instruction a week, you guys, it sticks better. A lot of times what happens is we'd have students in previous classes before we were doing this everyday thing that would have time off to self-study and would forget to ask questions, and they'd lose it and not understand what they were supposed to be doing in certain aspects. But when we do everyday courses, we see that the material sticks a lot better. So just trust me and Adam. You're in good hands. We'll take care of you guys. But yeah, not trying to scare you guys. That's the last thing I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to inform you of some of the things that we need to be looking for. And there's a lot. But you guys will do great. I promise you. Speaking of which, it's been a while since I've stood on my soapbox and preached about the ADX. Where's everybody at with the ADX?
Just studying and trying to get ready for it.
Okay.
This is the first weekend I have had since the class started to look at it.
All right.
I'm about the same. I'm just struggling finding time to study in all general with work and everything.
Yeah.
I plan on taking the test while I'm in St. George. It's not quite feasible for me to do it here.
Yeah. So what I recommend once again is it took me, and I'm not shy to share this, it took me 5 years to bring up the courage to take the ADX. Like, the test sucks. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but I regret that so bad. The one thing that I learned was that when I scheduled the test and made it a final date and was like, all right, I'm taking the test on this date, I studied my ass off leading up to it harder than I had studied in the previous 5 years. I actually sat down at a computer, I moved into my parents' house, away from my 4 kids, and locked myself in a room for 10 hours and studied the test for a total of 4 days. So if that's what it takes, and it was 2 different weekends, so I studied Saturday, Sunday, and took the test on Sunday the following week. But like, force yourself to sit down at the computer and hammer it out. You know, if you have to lock yourself in a closet and have somebody feed you under the door, just get it done, because it will pay off dividends. That is the number one hurdle for getting your dispatch license. So if you guys need to break away from studying this material in order to study the ADX, you have my blessing. Like 100%. You can catch up on this. It's all recorded. It's all put on YouTube. You can catch up on this, but get that ADX done, because that is the number one hurdle for every student we've ever had. And I wish there was a way for us to study it in class. There just isn't. The absolute best way to study for the ADX is 100% to go through the test prep software and follow it religiously. You know, just make sure that you're getting that ADX done. I would highly suggest using this weekend, since there's not really any homework. I mean, we've got the tests that we're going to take on Tuesday, but here's another tip for you guys. So studying the ADX. Let me pull this up really quick. Got to remember where I put it. Okay, so when you're studying for the ADX, the ones that they're going to ask you multiple questions on, we're talking 2 to 3, maybe up to 5, will be the Part 91, 121, and 135. So the FARs, right? The FARs, and then weight and balance, and weather. So those are the ones that you're going to get like probably multiple. And when I say multiple questions, I'm saying like 4 or 5, right? Because if you look at all these different sections that they've got to pick through, the most they can ask you from any one of those sections would be 5, and cover them all equally. So certain ones to study would be those. As far as the flight planning, they can only throw in 1 or 2 of the actual, like, calculate this type flight plan. Let me pull this up. Oh man, I can't just skip through questions on this right now. I chose the wrong way to study. So like, trying to find an example. Well, like that last one. So these types of questions, like to figure it out mathematically would take you an eternity. Got to know to pull all of this information. Then you got to know where to look on the chart and how to calculate the differences. Then you've got to go to this chart and actually calculate the crosswind component, and then go back to this chart, and then like it will just take you too long to calculate everything out to the point where you get the hour of 1 hour and 7 minutes, right? So a lot of those questions, seriously, just memorizing the answer is the best medicine for that. And there's little cheats on that memory aid. I shouldn't call them cheats. They're on the memory aid. There's an example of how to actually memorize those answers. But once again, the actual like calculate all of this information is going to be done or you're only going to have like one or two of those questions typically, probably 99% of the time.
How many questions overall on the ADX?
What is it, 80 questions? So 80 questions, I want to say you can get 23 incorrect. So you have to pass with a score of 70% or higher. 70 divided by 0.7. Oops, wrong way. Did that wrong. So 56 questions minus the 23. Oops. Oh my gosh. This is making me mad. So nope.
24.
There we go. Oh my gosh, I don't know why I'm being so dumb with my math tonight. Ugh, I had the answer there, but anyways, 24 questions, okay? 24 questions, you still pass. So what I did and what I learned from Adam was I went through the test and blazed through it as fast as I can, just going through it and making sure that I answered all the ones that I was 100% for sure, without a doubt, had memorized the answer and knew I had the correct answer. And I just went through and just did all of those. All 80 questions, just blazed through it as fast as I can. At the end of that, I went through and counted how many I was 100% sure on. And I had already made up in my mind, if I had gotten to the end of the test, to the 80 questions, and there was 15 or less that I had answered with 100% certainty correctly, I would just close the test and be done with it. I got to the end of the test and there was 19 that I hadn't, that I wasn't 100% confident on. And so I went through those 19 and I just answered them the best that I could. The ones that I knew were going to take me a really long time to figure out, I didn't answer. And I broke it down to 8 that I answered fairly quickly, about 50-50 confidence. And then the last couple, I just, went through, did the calculation the best I could, just kind of gave it my best try, and then I turned in the test. So, do it how you want to, approach it how you want to, but that's a pretty good technique of, I know that I can miss 24 questions. My buffer is, basically 10 questions. And anything under that, I'm good to just kind of go through and just check, and then turn it in.
Is the ADX test when you say turn it in, you just click submit and you get instant recognition back as to pass fail?
Yeah, you actually, once you click submit, you go out to the person that administers it and they get the pass fail there and they'll print off the sheet.
So you don't know when you're sitting at the computer, it doesn't give you the answer? Or it doesn't give you the test result?
I don't believe it does. I may be wrong on that. It's been 2 years or a year since I took it, but
I've taken 3 or 4 federally administered tests in the securities industry, and each one of them gives you a pass-fail, so that when you're sitting in front of the computer, you can either throw your arms in the air or smash your head on the desk.
Yeah. I'll tell you.
I have too many bruises.
You didn't have too many what?
I say, fortunately, I don't have too many bruises on my head from the desk.
So I'll tell you this. There was a student that took it, failed by 1 question, twice in a row. 1 stinking question. That has to be the most frustrating thing in the world. Yeah, can't even imagine. Yeah, but the last time that he took it, he passed with an 80%. So, but yeah, please, please, please knock out the ADX. I don't know. I can ask some of my former students on some tips that they may have, and give them to you guys if you guys want. But
yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, that way you don't hear the same medicine from me and Adam, because we feel the same way about the test. And Adam, I got to give credit to him because he's been teaching this course for 6 years, and he's had a couple hundred students come through the course, and he knows what works 99% of the time. So, got to give credit to him as far as that goes. He knows the system pretty well. But I will definitely reach out to a couple of my former students and see if they've got any additional advice. But so that's my soapbox preaching. As far as systems go, that wraps it up. We're pretty much getting close to our Friday buffer of 9 o'clock. Not a whole lot more that I can really muster up as far as systems go. Any questions on them? On anything we've gone over this week? Anything I can help you with?
Looking forward to that review and prep for the quiz.
Yeah. I think I'm going to go through the test and just make sure that it covers everything I want to again. We've gotten some feedback from the director and the training manager at SkyWest as far as like some things that our students need to work on. So I just want to make sure that we've incorporated those into the test. But other than that, you guys will get the full-blown test review on Monday, and we will take it on Tuesday. So one thing that I did want to say is that this next week, as we get into meteorology, I probably won't be having a break immediately following the test, just because we've got a lot of material to cover and I want to dedicate as much time as we can to meteorology. Pretty important subject. So we'll be cracking at meteorology for the next week. Well, if there's nothing, then I will release you guys.
Have a great weekend.